There are moments when a case suddenly changes. Not because investigators announce a major breakthrough, not because new evidence is released, but because someone with an enormous platform decides to shine a spotlight on it. That's exactly what happened this week. A phrase has been spreading across social media ever since Nancy Grace devoted an entire episode of Crime Stories to the death of 18-year-old Nolan Wells. Now that Nancy's awake, everybody's going to jail. You've probably seen it. Thousands of people are repeating some version of that sentence. Some are celebrating, others are skeptical. But almost everyone agrees on one thing. Nancy Grace's arrival has changed the conversation. The real question is, has it changed the investigation? Or has it simply changed how millions of people are looking at it? Welcome back to OB Crime Stories. If you're new here, subscribe for fact-based coverage of developing true crime investigations and let us know where you're watching from. Today's story isn't just about Nolan Wells. It's about what happens when a nationally known television personality enters an active investigation, and why that can be both incredibly helpful and surprisingly dangerous at the same time. Because if we're being honest, this isn't really about one television episode. It's about the power of attention, and what attention can and cannot actually accomplish. Let's begin with what happened. Only hours after Nolan Wells was laid to rest in Mississippi, Nancy Grace dedicated a full hour of her program Crime Stories to examining the circumstances surrounding his death. During the broadcast, she reviewed publicly known details of the case and questioned how the investigation has unfolded so far. She focused on inconsistencies that have already been widely discussed by Nolan's family, their representatives, and others following the case. Nothing she presented was entirely new. That's an important point. There wasn't a newly discovered witness. There wasn't a leaked investigative document. There wasn't a surprise confession or previously unseen piece of evidence. Instead, Nancy Grace took information already available to the public and examined it before a national audience numbering in the millions. And sometimes, that alone is enough to completely change the trajectory of public attention. To understand why people reacted so strongly, you first have to understand who Nancy Grace is. Long before she became one of America's most recognizable television legal commentators, she worked as a prosecutor. For decades, she's built a reputation for aggressively questioning investigators whenever she believes important questions remain unanswered. Supporters see her as someone willing to challenge powerful institutions when families feel ignored. Critics argue that her certainty has, at times, moved faster than the evidence itself. Both perspectives exist. Both have followed her throughout her career, and both are relevant here, because the same qualities that have made Nancy Grace influential are also the qualities that generate debate whenever she covers an investigation that is still unfolding. Nobody has been charged in Nolan Wells' death. Key forensic questions remain unresolved. The investigation is still active. That means every public discussion carries weight. Especially when it's happening on one of the largest crime platforms in the country. During the episode, Grace repeatedly returned to two issues she believes deserve closer examination. The first involved conflicting accounts of Nolan's final hours. Public statements about what happened on Horn Island have included different descriptions of Nolan's movements before he disappeared. One account suggests he chose to remain behind with a young woman who, according to friends, wasn't well known within the group. Another version has suggested Nolan was actually making his way back toward the boat. Nancy Grace argued that those two accounts cannot both describe the same sequence of events. As she put it, "I don't know who's lying, but somebody's lying." That statement quickly spread across social media, becoming one of the most widely shared moments from the broadcast. The second issue involved Nolan's cell phone. Nolan's mother has publicly stated that after accessing his accounts, she believed certain content from the day he disappeared was no longer there. She has also discussed differences between location information generated by separate digital services and where the phone was eventually recovered. Grace questioned whether those discrepancies deserved closer examination. It's worth noting that location technology isn't perfect. Different applications use different methods to estimate position, and inaccuracies can occur for many reasons, including signal quality, device settings, and environmental conditions. So, by itself, inconsistent location data doesn't establish wrongdoing, but it can raise questions investigators may want to answer through forensic analysis. Those examinations, according to public reporting, are expected to play an important role in the investigation moving forward. Here's what many people missed after the episode aired. Nancy Grace didn't suddenly solve the case. She didn't announce an arrest. She didn't reveal secret evidence. What changed wasn't the evidence. What changed was the audience. Within hours, millions of additional people were talking about Nolan Wells. Millions more were asking questions. Millions more were paying attention. And whether you love Nancy Grace or disagree with her approach entirely, one thing is difficult to dispute. Attention is one of the most powerful forces in modern criminal investigations. The question is whether that attention ultimately helps uncover the truth or creates new problems of its own, because history shows it can do both. And that's where this story becomes much bigger than one television episode. In the next part, we're going to examine exactly what celebrity attention can do to an active investigation, and why some families see it as their greatest hope, while others worry about the consequences. If you've followed enough high-profile investigations, you've probably noticed something. Some cases disappear from the headlines within a week. Others seem impossible to escape. The evidence may not change overnight, but public attention does. And sometimes, attention changes everything. That's why Nancy Grace's involvement matters, even if she didn't introduce a single new piece of evidence. Because investigations don't happen in a vacuum. They happen under different levels of public scrutiny. When very few people are watching, updates often arrive quietly, press conferences become less frequent, media coverage slows, public interest fades. But when millions of people begin asking questions every day, the environment changes. Every decision is examined. Every delay is noticed. Every public statement is analyzed. That's one of the biggest reasons families often welcome national media attention. It's not because television personalities have the authority to solve crimes. They don't. It's because attention creates accountability. Public officials generally understand that their work will receive far greater scrutiny when an investigation attracts sustained national interest. That doesn't mean investigators change the evidence. It doesn't mean prosecutors change the law. It simply means more people are paying attention to how the process unfolds. For families worried their loved one's case could gradually fade from public view, that kind of visibility can be incredibly important. And that's exactly what Nancy Grace brings. She has spent decades building one of the largest audiences in crime television. Whether viewers agree with her conclusions or not, millions of people listen when she speaks. For Nolan Wells' family, that means something very simple. This case is much less likely to disappear quietly. There's another reason her appearance carried so much weight. Nancy Grace doesn't approach cases as a traditional news anchor. She approaches them through the lens of someone who once prosecuted criminal cases. That background shapes the questions she asks. Instead of simply repeating timelines, she often focuses on contradictions. Instead of accepting public explanations at face value, she asks whether those explanations can logically exist together. That's exactly what happened here. Her attention centered on two unresolved issues already circulating publicly. First, the conflicting accounts surrounding Nolan's final movements. If one version of events says he remained behind on Horn Island, and another suggests he was heading back toward the boat, those accounts cannot both accurately describe the same moment. That doesn't automatically prove anyone intentionally misled investigators. Memories can differ. Witnesses can misunderstand events. People under stress can recall details differently. Those possibilities always have to be considered. But conflicting accounts are still something investigators work to reconcile, and Grace argued they deserved exactly that level of scrutiny. Her second focus was the cell phone. Again, she wasn't introducing new evidence. She was highlighting publicly discussed questions involving location data and digital activity. Modern smartphones generate enormous amounts of information: GPS estimates, application data, location history, communication records, device logs. Each system collects information differently. That's why digital forensic examinations often require specialists. Small discrepancies can have completely ordinary explanations. Larger discrepancies may require additional investigation. At this stage, those questions remain part of the broader investigative process. Perhaps the biggest reason Nancy Grace's episode resonated wasn't anything she actually said. It was who was saying it. By the time her program aired, Nolan Wells's case had already drawn support from several nationally recognized figures. Civil rights attorney Ben Crump has been representing Nolan's family, bringing significant legal resources and national visibility to the case. Reverend Al Sharpton has publicly supported the family while urging patience and calling for a thorough investigation rather than premature conclusions. Reports have also indicated that filmmaker Tyler Perry helped the family with funeral expenses during an extraordinarily difficult time. Meanwhile, Colin Kaepernick's organization funded an independent autopsy that has become part of the broader public discussion surrounding the case. Media entrepreneur Byron Allen has also been publicly identified as one of the prominent supporters following developments. Taken individually, each of those names attracts attention. Taken together, they represent something much larger. This investigation has become a national story, and once that happens, the dynamics surrounding a case begin to change. Not because famous people determine the outcome, they don't. Evidence still determines outcomes. Investigators still conduct interviews. Forensic specialists still analyze physical evidence. Prosecutors still decide whether charges are supported under the law. But national attention changes expectations. People begin watching more closely. Questions receive wider circulation. Families often feel less isolated. And public officials know their decisions will be examined by audiences far beyond their local community. For Nolan's family, that visibility can provide reassurance that their son's case continues receiving public attention. That's an understandable reaction, especially considering the historical concerns many communities have expressed about cases they believe received insufficient attention in the past. But attention comes with another reality. The bigger the spotlight becomes, the harder it is to control what happens inside it. Supportive voices multiply, so do speculative ones. Helpful information spreads, so does misinformation. Responsible discussion grows. Unfortunately, so can harassment. And that's where this story takes a more complicated turn. Because while celebrity attention can keep difficult questions alive, history also shows it can unintentionally fuel online speculation that reaches far beyond the available evidence. In this case, we've already seen examples of just how quickly that can happen. And in Part 3, we'll examine the other side of the spotlight, the unintended consequences of national attention, the spread of misinformation, and why investigators often warn against confusing public speculation with established fact. There's an old saying in journalism: a spotlight doesn't just reveal what's there, it also attracts everything around it. That's exactly what's happened in the Nolan Wells case. The same national attention that many people hope will help uncover the truth has also created a very different problem, one that's becoming increasingly common in high-profile investigations. The internet doesn't wait for evidence. It fills in the blanks, and once millions of people become emotionally invested in a case, those blanks can quickly turn into rumors, accusations, and narratives that spread far faster than verified facts ever do. We've already seen signs of that happening here. As interest in Nolan's case has grown, so has the amount of speculation online. False claims have circulated across social media. AI-generated videos and fabricated screenshots have been shared as though they were authentic. Rumors have spread so widely that people with no confirmed connection to the investigation have found themselves pulled into conversations they never expected to be part of. In one instance, public confusion reportedly became so widespread that the family of an unrelated young woman felt compelled to publicly clarify that she was not the person being discussed online. Think about that for a moment. One investigation had become so consumed by speculation that an entirely separate family found themselves responding to rumors they had nothing to do with. That's the reality of a viral investigation. Once the spotlight reaches a certain size, it becomes almost impossible to control where it points next. Then there's another issue: the human tendency to solve mysteries before the evidence does. It's understandable. When people hear conflicting accounts, they naturally begin asking which version is correct. When questions remain unanswered, people instinctively look for someone who can provide certainty. That's why Nancy Grace's comment, "I don't know who's lying, but somebody's lying," generated so much discussion. At its core, she's pointing out a logical reality. If two accounts describe the same event in ways that cannot both be accurate, investigators will eventually need to determine why. Were memories affected by stress? Did witnesses misunderstand each other? Did someone unknowingly provide inaccurate information, or was someone intentionally misleading investigators? Those are all possibilities that investigators may consider. At this stage, however, they remain questions, not conclusions. That's an important distinction. Because once a statement reaches millions of viewers, many people stop hearing it as an investigative question. They hear it as confirmation that they've already identified the problem. And that's where public discussion can begin moving faster than the investigation itself. History has shown this pattern repeatedly. A nationally followed case develops. Pieces of information emerge gradually. Online communities begin comparing timelines. Individual statements are dissected. Social media users build theories. Videos are created. Posts go viral. Soon, thousands, or even millions, of people become convinced they've solved the case before investigators have completed their work. Sometimes those theories later align with the evidence. Many times, they don't. The challenge is that once people become emotionally invested in a particular narrative, changing their minds becomes remarkably difficult, even when new evidence points somewhere else. That's why investigators often ask the public to distinguish between suspicion and proof. The two are not the same thing. Another consequence of intense publicity is something people rarely think about. Pressure doesn't only affect investigators, it also affects witnesses. Imagine being one of the last people known to have spent time with someone who later dies under tragic circumstances. Now imagine your name, your photograph, and your social media accounts suddenly being discussed by thousands of strangers. Every public appearance is analyzed. Every old photograph is scrutinized. Every sentence you've ever posted online is interpreted through the lens of a tragedy. Whether someone ultimately has important information, incomplete memories, or no involvement beyond being present, the experience itself can become overwhelming. That's one reason investigators typically prefer to interview witnesses before those witnesses spend weeks absorbing online theories. Human memory is complicated. People naturally revisit events after hearing what others believe happened. Over time, those outside narratives can influence how events are remembered or described. That doesn't mean anyone is acting dishonestly. It's simply one reason why investigators try to preserve the integrity of witness recollections as early as possible. It's also important to remember where this investigation stands today. There are still significant questions that remain unresolved. The official cause and manner of Nolan Wells's death have not been publicly finalized. Forensic examinations continue. Digital evidence remains part of the broader investigative process. Investigators are still responsible for evaluating witness statements, physical evidence, forensic testing, and every other piece of information necessary before reaching legal conclusions. That process can be frustratingly slow, especially for families seeking answers, especially for communities demanding accountability. But careful investigations often require time precisely because investigators are attempting to separate verified fact from speculation. This is where Nancy Grace's involvement becomes both powerful and complicated. Her platform keeps difficult questions alive. That's valuable. It ensures millions of people continue paying attention to an investigation that many believe deserves careful scrutiny. At the same time, the attention surrounding her program can unintentionally amplify speculation far beyond the evidence currently available. Those two realities exist together. Supporting a thorough investigation doesn't require assuming anyone's guilt. Likewise, recognizing that questions remain unanswered doesn't require dismissing the concerns raised by Nolan's family. Both ideas can exist at the same time, and perhaps they should, because the ultimate goal isn't to win an argument online. It's to understand what actually happened. That distinction matters more now than ever. As the spotlight grows brighter, another question begins to emerge. What happens when public expectation starts demanding an ending before investigators are ready to provide one? Because that's where celebrity attention becomes most influential and potentially most complicated. In Part 4, we'll examine the enormous pressure now facing investigators, why high-profile cases can become difficult to navigate, and why the difference between public expectation and legal proof may determine how this story ultimately unfolds. By now, the spotlight on Nolan Wells's case is impossible to ignore. What began as a local tragedy has become a national conversation. Every interview is dissected. Every statement is analyzed. Every development sparks another wave of commentary across social media, and with each passing day, one expectation grows louder. Somebody needs to be held accountable. That desire is understandable. An 18-year-old lost his life. His family wants answers. The public wants answers. But wanting answers and having enough evidence to support legal action are not the same thing. That's where investigations often become most difficult. One of the biggest misconceptions surrounding high-profile cases is the belief that public pressure can determine legal outcomes. It can't. Public attention can encourage transparency. It can motivate continued media coverage. It can increase scrutiny of how an investigation is conducted, but it cannot lower the legal standard required for investigators or prosecutors to act. Investigators still have to establish facts. Forensic specialists still have to complete their analyses. Witness statements still have to be evaluated. Every conclusion must ultimately rest on evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny, not on public opinion. That's an important distinction, because the louder a case becomes, the easier it is to confuse momentum with proof. Think about how quickly narratives form online. A new interview appears. People immediately begin comparing body language. Someone notices an inconsistency. Another person posts a timeline. A video goes viral. Suddenly, thousands of people believe they've identified exactly what happened. But investigators don't have the luxury of reaching conclusions that way. They have to verify. They have to corroborate. They have to eliminate alternative explanations before deciding whether the evidence supports criminal charges. That process is often slower than the public would like, but it's slow for a reason. Justice isn't measured by speed, it's measured by accuracy. This is also why celebrity attention creates such an unusual dynamic. When someone like Nancy Grace asks difficult questions on national television, those questions don't stay inside the television studio. They become social media discussions, podcast topics, YouTube videos, TikTok clips, news articles. Millions of people begin examining the same issues simultaneously. That level of attention can absolutely benefit a legitimate investigation by ensuring important questions continue to receive public attention. But it also creates enormous expectations. People begin assuming that because the case is receiving national coverage, dramatic developments must be just around the corner. History tells us that isn't always how investigations unfold. Sometimes additional attention uncovers significant new evidence. Sometimes it simply confirms what investigators were already doing behind the scenes. Sometimes it reveals that earlier assumptions, made by both supporters and critics, were incomplete. The spotlight doesn't determine which outcome occurs. The evidence does. That's perhaps the hardest reality for the public to accept. High-profile attention doesn't guarantee dramatic answers. It guarantees greater visibility. Those are very different things. Visibility means more people are watching. More reporters are asking questions. More updates receive national coverage. It does not mean investigators suddenly possess evidence they didn't have yesterday. Nor does it mean arrests become inevitable. You're on the ground, reporter. I tell you what's happening anywhere, anytime. Some move quickly. Others require months or even years to reach legally supportable conclusions. The amount of media coverage doesn't change those fundamental realities. This is why it's worth separating two different ideas that often become blurred together. The first is accountability, the second is certainty. Accountability means expecting investigators to conduct a thorough, professional, and transparent investigation. It means asking whether evidence is being collected, whether forensic testing is progressing, whether appropriate interviews are being conducted, whether legitimate questions are receiving legitimate answers. Those are reasonable expectations. Certainty is something entirely different. Certainty means believing we already know exactly what happened before investigators have completed their work. That's where problems begin, because certainty has a way of becoming resistant to new evidence. If people emotionally commit to one explanation too early, every future development tends to be interpreted through that same lens. Information that supports the preferred narrative is amplified. Information that complicates it is dismissed. That's not how investigations work. Real investigations often become more complicated, not less. As additional evidence emerges, consider what investigators are likely balancing in a case receiving this level of attention. Every public statement will be scrutinized, every timeline adjustment will be questioned, every delay may generate criticism, yet releasing incomplete information too early can also create problems. Witnesses may begin tailoring their recollections around public narratives. Potential jurors may develop strong opinions long before any courtroom proceedings. Individuals connected to the case may experience intense public pressure regardless of whether they've committed any wrongdoing. These are challenges investigators frequently face in nationally followed cases. Their responsibility is not simply to answer public questions, it's to build a factual record capable of standing up under legal examination. Those goals don't always move at the same speed. There's another point worth considering. Many people have described Nancy Grace's involvement as the moment the big guns arrived. That reaction says something important about public confidence. It reflects a belief that nationally recognized voices can accomplish what ordinary families often cannot. In some respects, that's true. Large platforms attract attention. Attention encourages oversight. Oversight can help ensure important investigations remain visible, but it's also worth remembering what those platforms cannot do. They cannot examine forensic evidence. They cannot issue subpoenas. They cannot compel testimony. They cannot determine whether legal standards for criminal charges have been met. Only investigators, prosecutors, forensic experts, and ultimately the courts can do that. Media attention can influence the environment surrounding an investigation. It cannot replace the investigation itself. As this case continues developing, there will almost certainly be additional headlines, new interviews, further analysis, more commentary, perhaps more public disagreement. That's the nature of high-profile investigations. The challenge for everyone following the case, including us, is resisting the temptation to mistake confidence for certainty. Some of the strongest voices in any investigation speak with tremendous conviction. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes later, evidence tells a more complicated story. The responsible approach is to remain open to wherever the verified facts ultimately lead. That doesn't mean ignoring difficult questions. It means allowing those questions to remain questions until the evidence provides reliable answers. At the end of the day, everyone involved should be working toward the same objective, not simply an answer, the correct answer. Those aren't always the same thing. A rushed conclusion may satisfy public curiosity for a moment. A carefully supported conclusion is far more likely to withstand scrutiny years from now, and that's ultimately what Nolan Wells' family and every family searching for answers deserves. Because once this investigation reaches its conclusion, the quality of that conclusion will matter far more than how quickly it arrived. In our final part, we'll step back from the headlines and ask the larger question this case raises. What does it say about our justice system when a case seems to change the moment a national television personality starts paying attention? And what should all of us, as viewers, learn from that reality?